Hello, my name is Margaret Adele, and welcome to another rambling discussion. Today we're going to talk about Zero TBR challenges, namely their biggest issues and pitfalls. Now, I am not against a Zero TBR challenge. I am on a TBR challenge of my own. I refer to it more as lower the TBR because I have no delusions that I'm ever going to reach zero. There are a ton of benefits to them, but we also need to talk about the pitfalls because I believe people need to have a full picture of what they're getting into when they're entering a big kind of challenge like this, or else you're kind of setting people up for failure. But first things first, what is a Zero TBR challenge? A Zero TBR is a kind of no-buy challenge, but specifically for the bookish world. An owned TBR is the list of books a person owns but has not read. It is to be read. And in some cases, these TBRs can get large, like hundreds of books large. When I started mine in January of 2022, I was sitting at 430. So it's a lot. And a Zero TBR challenge is definitely in response to that kind of overconsumption that BookTube has been known for. Now, it can be so complex with systems of gamification and boards and all of that, but at its most simplistic, a Zero TBR challenge says that you have to be reading more books that you already own than bringing in new books. So for me personally, my challenge is set up that I cannot get a new book at all from reviews, from the library, from a regular store, a used bookstore, anything. I cannot get any new books until I have read or unhauled two that I already own. So I am still bringing in new books every month. However, I am bringing in fewer new books than I am reading, thereby lowering my overall TBR. Now, that is the most simplistic version. It can vary a lot. I've seen other people say they have to read 3 or 4 owned books before they can get a new one. Early on in my challenge, I would have to unhaul 5 ebooks before I could get one new one. It varies a ton person to person, but the general gist is you should be reading more than you are buying. And in that way, yes, it is a kind of no-buy challenge. Now, I do know that other people will often put in a lot of exceptions, if they get ARCs from a publisher, if they have subscription boxes, all of this will be like, that doesn't count. Mine is very strict. No new books. I will leave that review request in my inbox, send the author a quick, hey, no slots open yet, get back to you later, and then go on. But I am also fairly severe in how I do it. However, that 430 that I started with is now down to 70. So it does work. And I did want to go over a little bit of the benefits, just real quickly, that it has before we jump deep into the problems. So, some of the pros real quick. 1, it is more eco-friendly. All no-buy challenges are more eco-friendly than the alternative because every time you buy a good new, you are using up fresh water, fossil fuels, electricity to get that good made. So if you're buying fewer of them, fewer of those resources are being used. 2, it is more cost-effective. Very simply, you are not buying as many books. You are saving more money. 3, it helps break free of capitalism and the impulse to buy. We are raised in a capitalistic society, and in a lot of cases, we are trained from birth to spend at the drop of a hat, to constantly see spending money as a solution to problems. And so any kind of no-buy challenge kind of breaks that. Yes, you want to read a new book. What books do you already have that could fulfill that purpose rather than going out and getting a new one? And it helps kind of start breaking the constant impulse to buy whenever the urge takes you. 4, and lastly, this one was the most unexpected of the pros for me, but it forces you to be more honest and thoughtful with yourself. Because when you only have limited slots to buy new books, you have to think a lot harder on whether or not you actually want the book you're getting. Okay, if I get this new book, I will have to read 2 others before I can get another new one. Is this new book worth that? So it kind of forces you to be honest with what you really want to read, and also helps you learn your own tastes. Like for me, I learned I don't do Highlander romances. I unhauled so many Highlander romances over this challenge, I don't know why I had them. But that kind of self-awareness can come when you are forced to be very choosy with what you're picking to read. So now that we've talked about the benefits, we're going to go more in depth to some of the pitfalls. I do still think the benefits outweigh these pitfalls, but they exist and we should talk about them. And we'll start with the obvious one. You can't always control the rate at which new books come into your life, especially if you are known to friends and family as the bookish person. Because once you are known as the reader of the friend group, of the family, of whatever, the next time then big gift giving time comes, you're gonna come home with the stack of whatever. Or, for example, if you are a social media influencer and you are on an ARC list or a publisher's list, or indie authors just know you review indie, you'll get a lot of review requests or just straight up ARCs. Like, I cannot control when indie authors send me review requests. It's totally out of my hands. And it can be really awkward to have the conversations with people like, hey, love the gifts, but I need to have more control over the books in my possession right now because I need to get this giant TBR manageable. So maybe go for gift cards instead of piles of books. That way they're still helping you get books, but you have a little bit more say of what those books are and when they come in. As for things like being on a publisher's ARC list, I'm not gonna lie, that does not sound fun to me at all, because I don't trust that they wouldn't just keep sending me books I wasn't interested in, so I would never sign up for those. But again, you can decide to just put them aside. And yes, with ARCs, it's so much trickier because you don't want to sell ARCs because that's unethical, but also you didn't ask for the ARC, the publisher just sent it to you. So does like that free you up from the responsibility? And why are they suddenly giving you this responsibility? Is it up to you to give it to another influencer? Like that kind of thing. I would in general make sure that whatever agreement you have with whatever publishers or authors you are doing as a reviewer, that you have some level of control over the ARCs coming in, that you have some ability to say, hey, I need you to talk to me first before you just send me a copy. Because for me personally, I can't control the rate at which indie authors send me emails. I could go a month without getting a single one. I could get 8 in a weekend. I have no control over it. And it is kind of awkward to be like, so hey, I can't give you an answer either way right now because I don't have the slot open, and I don't want to say no just because I don't have that slot open. So you're gonna have to wait. And for the most part, for me at least, those conversations aren't terrible. They're doable. I've never had to have one of those conversations with a publisher though. It might be more awkward at that angle. But get as much control over it as you can, and then also you can control the challenge itself. So for me personally, I pause my TBR challenge twice a year for an entire month. April, the month of my birthday, and December, the month of holidays. This way, even if I do get gifts or gift cards that I want to spend, I don't feel beholden to the challenge during those months, and therefore I can restart at the next month. Of course, if you're going to pause it, this also means that you can't count any of the books you're reading towards opening those other slots. You kind of got to pause it entirely and get back to it to make it the most effective. But yeah, the Zero TBR challenge kind of assumes that you have a lot of control over the books you're being given or being brought into your TBR. So in some cases, you might need to lay some groundwork before you even start the challenge to make sure that you have that level of control, at least to a certain extent, over what's being added to your TBR in the first place. Next up, a psychological phenomenon. A Zero TBR challenge can give you a serious feeling of deprivation. Like I mentioned before, we are all raised under capitalism, and we are raised to view purchasing of material goods as an innate reflex of our regular lives. We like someone, we buy them a thing. We have an important date coming up, again with friends, we buy things. We're feeling bad, we buy things. We're feeling really good, we buy things. There are entire holidays based on buying things. It is so difficult to break yourself out of that cycle of reflexively buying things constantly, especially when, for example, you're just hanging out in a store or a library, as you do, and you see a book that you think you'd really like, but you don't have any free openings in your challenge. And you have this feeling of, oh, I really want that. And I'm not gonna lie, I have fudged my challenge more than once to where I basically put myself in debt to myself, if that makes sense, where I see a book that I just like hardcore want to buy. I know it. I've been looking for a book just like it for so long, and I'm seeing it. I'm like, maybe I'm at a used bookstore, so I know if I walk away, there is no guarantee it's going to be there when I come back. I just say, okay, and I buy it even when I don't have a new slot. And then I have to read even more books to get that next slot open, and then more books after that to get another slot open. So this usually only happens for me when I am just so determined that that book is going to bring me so much joy that I'm willing to essentially go into debt in my challenge to make it happen. And that can be really hard at first. I remember times early on in the challenge where I would see a new book that I wanted, you know, a new shift or romance from my favorite author, whatever. And I would literally immediately go to my Kindle app and like unhaul 5 books so I could open all the slots I needed to get it. And early on in the challenge, that's pretty simple, or at least it was for me, especially if you have a lot of those like super cheap or free ebook downloads. Like that was so much of my TBR when I started this. That can help, but there definitely is I want that. It tests your self-discipline and it feels like deprivation, and it can take a while to break yourself of those capitalist habits. Like there are cases where I don't even step into a library or a bookstore if I don't have a slot open, or I will like purposefully avoid the book section of whatever general thrift store I'm in to not even be tempted. It can be a lot, especially at first when you're still retraining your brain, but it can be pushed through. I think that's probably the biggest hurdle and the biggest stumbling block that you're going to face early on when you start retraining your brain from the constant buy a new thing whenever you want to type of mindset. But it can be done. It's just not fun. This next pitfall might be really surprising to some people. I know when I was first on an eco-friendly journey, this aspect was really surprising to me, but it is really difficult to ethically and sustainably unhaul a large amount of material goods, yes, including books. We have this idea that we can just bring these bags and boxes full of stuff to a thrift store, drop it off, and we walk away guilt-free, thinking that all of those things are going to go to other people that really want them. In truth, that's not actually what happens. General thrift stores, especially clothing stores, are given such gigantic mountains of stuff, they literally could not put all of it on a rack. Most of it will go to recycling plants and, yes, get thrown out. They just do not have the manpower to sort through it. They don't have the space in the store. People aren't buying certain types of objects enough for that to be a thing. And it goes for secondhand bookstores. So I give most of my old books to a secondhand store that gives store credit for, I think it's like 25% of the book's original retail price. But they'll even tell you when you drop off the bag that if something isn't available to be put out, are you okay with it getting sent to a recycling center or getting thrown out? Because not everything is going to go out. Now, obviously, if you're unhauling like the latest, greatest hardback YA darling, yeah, that's probably getting sold. But if you are doing a lesser paperback from years ago, or a book like, Twilight, Divergent, like that set of books, those are everywhere over thrift stores. I remember walking into a used bookstore and they literally had an entire shelf of Twilight and the sequels. So in some cases, those books just aren't selling, and it doesn't make sense for the store to keep those books on a shelf if they're not actually gonna be purchased. Like, it doesn't help the store to just be a depository for books to help people feel better about themselves. And I know things get weird when we talk about throwing books out specifically, because people have this kind of, not worship, but the way we view books gets a little weird, because sometimes a book just is going to get thrown out because no one wants to read it. And I tell you this as someone working in a school, someone that has worked with foster kids. No, there are not just this giant amount of people in need that want those old books. The impoverished people, like, they still want the same cool books that everyone else wants. And if they can't find it or can't afford it, they just go to the library for the most part. Like, this idea that every book can be foisted upon an impoverished person and they must want it. No, people still have tastes even when they're impoverished. They don't necessarily want that moldy paperback from a questionable sci-fi from 50 years ago. Some books just will have to be recycled. But the more sustainable and ethical way of doing it is essentially trying to make sure they go to people who will want them. Now, I'm very fortunate in that I have that local used bookstore that will send them to recycling so that they are still being disposed of ethically. They're not just ending up in a landfill. But in a lot of cases, if you don't have that, if you're not sure that that's going to be a thing, you might have to try and use your own secondhand sites. Like I think you have Pango Books. You have various other resale sites that you could try, especially again if you have those YA hardcovers. That's the latest greatest thing. That's probably going to get you a little bit of money. Not as much. I've seen a lot of people overprice a lot of books, but in general, the best way to help in this way is to try and at least lessen that giant TBR pile before you just drop it off to a thrift store or shove it all in a little free library. Like, yeah, you didn't want them. That doesn't necessarily mean someone else is guaranteed to want them. And that can be the most annoying part, especially if you're at the place where like most of what you're unhauling is physical books, because it's so much effort. It's so much more effort to try and like pick different places to make sure that those books are going to someone they'd want. I infinitely prefer unhauling ebooks. Just click delete. It's so much nicer. Another unforeseen challenge for me was I have become so quick to unhaul, to DNF unhaul. I'm done with a book in a way that I was not before, because I've always been a consummate DNFer. If I'm not feeling it within the first 15 pages, I'm done. But in a lot of cases, they would be temporary DNFs. Okay, I'm not feeling it now. Come back, try again later. But in the midst of a Zero TBR challenge, I am so much quicker to just be like, done, bye. And again, early on, a lot of these were ebooks where it was very, very easy to unhaul it. But in general, there's been a lot of cases where I don't give books second chances, aside from review books. And the reason that review books get second chances is I have to tell the author that I DNF'd. So a lot of times the idea that I'll have to have that conversation will spur me to try it again just in case, just so I can really make sure that I dislike the book enough to have that awkward conversation. But in general, I remember like in certain times even hoping that I dislike a book, because then I can not only unhaul it, but maybe I have the next 2 or 3 books in the series and I can unhaul those too. And I can get 3 books unhauled. Like that kind of thing. And it is kind of sad because I remember some of my favorite books were books that I had on my TBR for forever. I downloaded them for free from like BookBub or what have you and left them sitting in my library for a while. And then for some reason, a Readathon or something came up and they worked for the prompt. So I read it and I was like, I love this book. Best thing ever. I must read this entire series. However, I have to remind myself that that's not always the case. And basically have to understand that for the most part, those books that I downloaded for free and then left on my TBR for forever, I probably wouldn't enjoy. But it is kind of sad, the idea that I may be missing those diamonds in the rough, the next surprise favorite thing. And yes, I would have to maybe read 5 books I was meh about to find the next favorite thing, but is it worth it? I mean, generally, yes, I do think it's worth it. As bummed as I am that I'm not going to have a new, Fallen Empire by Lindsay Buroker just happening upon me, or Deanne Brenn's Our Bloody Pearl, all books that I stumbled upon in that way. I have so many more countless books that I didn't like that I kind of have to give up the idea of that. And DNF, yes, fairly regularly. And hopefully as I learn more about what I like and what I take in, I am taking in more books that I like, or getting more in depth in picking the books in the first place. Like I used to never do the whole, read the first few pages thing on Amazon or what have you. Started doing that a lot more because writing style is such a big thing for me that if I dislike the writing style, I'm DNFing it and all hauling in like 10 pages. So I can usually figure it out beforehand and just never buy the book in the first place, and that works a lot better. But still, I might be a little too unhaul happy here. Another unforeseen pitfall of the Zero TBR challenge is how much it keeps you more in your comfort zone than otherwise. For example, if I have read the 2 books and I have that new slot open and I'm going to get a new book, am I going to go for that experimental horror that I've heard great things about but isn't a genre I really read? Or am I going to go for this random monster romance because I love that genre? I'm going to tend towards the genres I already like, the authors I already like, and jumping into trying new authors, new genres gets a little bit trickier, and you're less likely to want to do that because you're going to want the sure thing. You're going to want to know that that slot you've used up, that now you have to read 2 more books before you can get another one. You're going to want to know that that is a book you're going to like. Now, this may or may not be a problem for people. I know plenty of people who are like, I know what I like. I have no intentions of trying to leave the genre. It's all smutty romance for me and nothing else. So that might not be a problem for you. I do feel bad because in some cases it's like, yeah, I would like to try reading more of this genre, or else I, build up a library of one specific genre and then I find myself bereft because I'm suddenly in the mood for something different, but I've been getting all of my new books in the safe genres and now I'm stuck. And it can be a little bit difficult in that to really feel like you can still risk those slots when you don't have a lot of them open. When you're not bringing in as many new books, it's a lot harder to take the risk on a book you may not like. So in a lot of cases, I've found myself doing a lot more research or sticking to doing series because, fortunately for me, this actually helps in that I sucked before at keeping up with series. And so having a TBR challenge where it's like, okay, you're gonna want to be fairly sure that that new book you get is gonna be one you like. I'm like, okay, I'm gonna get the next one in X series. And so it's actually been helpful for that. But yeah, I think I do need to try and find a way to get like more risky with it, to try more new things as opposed to sticking to only what I know will work. But again, this might be a pitfall for you. It might not. You might be totally happy reading only one genre ever. But for me, this was an unforeseen struggle. So these last 2 struggles are definitely more late game Zero TBR. When you are like under 100, you are really cracking down, you're making it work. Some new struggles can appear. And that's where I'm at right now because I am at around 70. And I am already struggling with some of these things. But the first one of these late game struggles is mood reading. Because before, with that giant TBR, I could usually be assured that I had at least a couple books of every genre. Every genre I had, there would be something for whatever mood I was in. But the more you read and the more you cut it down, especially if you're focusing a lot on specific genres, suddenly you have a lot fewer of that specific genre on your list. And you are in fact caught with a mood for a specific book that you don't own because you've already read all of them, but you didn't make sure to replace them. Like, that's the thing I learned the hard way is if I've been reading a lot of one specific genre and unlocking those new open slots, I gotta use some of those open slots to restock. I forgot to restock because I would read all of the monster romances I had, but then I would like get a bunch of review books, but then I had all of these review books and no monster romance, and I'm in a hazy monster romance mood and now I'm screwed. Like, that kind of thing. You have to like keep it restocked, at least having a couple books of whatever vibe of book you want to read for a mood reader. And that can get a little bit annoying because you're like, I forgot to fill up those slots and now I don't have any. Like, it's a lot. It's probably one of the lesser ones because in a lot of cases when I've had that inclination of, oh no, I'm out of it, like if I really went back and like searched deeply in my TBR, I could find a book that at least came close to scratching that itch, at least in one way or another. But for the most part, yeah, the fewer books you have, the harder mood reading gets. And you gotta have an idea of what different vibes you're gonna want and restock them at regular intervals. And our last one, our late game struggle that I did not see coming, was having a low TBR makes readathons and TBR games a lot harder. I did not foresee this, mostly because I don't do a lot with readathons and I'm only recently begun with TBR games, but the fewer books you have, the fewer books you have to choose from for prompts. I distinctly remember one month where I rolled for shifter romance. The prompt that came up was shifter romance. And I was like, awesome, I love this genre. I went back, I did not have a single one on my TBR. I looked through every single book I owned, not a single shifter romance. And I was like, how? How did I get here? But even still, I'm finding myself like refusing to read poetry or short story or nonfiction work as they come in because I know that I have a prompt for it on my list, but I only have this one book for it. So if I roll it and I've already read this book, I'm screwed. Like, it's very restrictive in that. And you also have readathon prompts, which can get very specific. Now, thankfully, from what I've seen, a lot of readathons, especially the month-long ones, aren't as restrictive as readathons used to be, because in like previous readathons, it used to be like, you have to read a book that takes place in spring, you have to read a book with X color, you know, whatever. And it could be really tricky, especially when you get like really low in your Zero TBR challenge, to find a book that matches that specific prompt. And then you have a list of specific prompts that you gotta fulfill. And now you're like, well, crap, am I gonna have to get a ton of new books for this readathon? And then what's the point of this if I have to, like, all of that? It can be a lot. And thankfully, like I mentioned before, a lot of readathons are a lot more lax. Like, from what I've seen, just from the previous ones I've taken part in, a lot of it is like, yeah, you can basically read whatever you want, but also you'll get bonus points if it's X, Y, and Z. Like, you can read whatever, but if it's spooky, you'll have 50 bonus points. If it's a queer or BIPOC author, you'll get 50 bonus points, but you don't have to have it to fulfill prompts, and I'm so happy with that new setup. But there are some readathons where it's like, all spooky books. You're like, do I even have enough spooky books on my TBR to fulfill all those prompts? Like, it can be iffy. But again, this is more of like a late stage one, like when you are under 100, you know, closing in on that final gap. It can be very tricky because you just don't have any guarantees that you're going to have a specific book that you already own. And in some cases, you can find yourself having to open several new slots just to participate in a readathon, and it can get frustrating. And in general, I think I would get to a point eventually where I would either have to pause the TBR challenge to participate in the readathon, or just accept that readathons aren't going to work. I've already changed my TBR game so often, moving around different prompts, adding like asterisks to prompts, like, if there's none of this type, read. Like, I have to add all this extra stuff to account for a forever diminishing range of options that I have. But I still do think it's worth it. In conclusion, I don't want to scare anyone off from doing a Zero TBR challenge. I've actually loved doing it. And mine's not technically a Zero TBR challenge, I just use that for search terms, but mine's more of a lower the TBR challenge, and I am so close to reaching my goal. I am hoping to get down to 50 books, and then I will pivot from read 2 by 1 to read 1 by 1, and hopefully just keep my TBR steady at that 50. I do know people who are like, no, we're getting to 0. I want to see that want to read shelf on Goodreads as 0 once in my life, and I cheer you on. I am not delusional enough about myself that I will ever do it. I'm not saying those other people are delusional. I'm saying I understand myself enough to know that that's not going to be a thing. I'm too much of a mood reader to not have at least a significant couple dozen books to choose from at any given moment. But I do love how this challenge has affected my brain because, and I've mentioned this before in a couple other places, the state at which my family's finances were, I did not have a lot of access to keeping up with specific book series, to even having a lot of internet access to research specific things. So this TBR challenge helping me learn how to become a data girly and really get into the numbers and formulate different methods of research and looking into books and developing, favorite authors and auto-buy authors. Like, these are things I never had back in the days when I was just getting whatever was at the library, whatever was at the thrift store. So I'm really grateful that I learned all of these kind of things that I never had the opportunity to learn when I didn't have access to the wealth and privilege needed to be a big data girly and buy books exactly as you need them. But I am still looking forward to the day when I'm done. I am still looking forward to the day when I get to read one, buy one, because now that I have developed these methods of research and things, I feel like I have a lot better grasp of what I want to read, and I would like more freedom to buy those things. But I do still think it's important for us to share some of the pitfalls and the struggles and realize that this is a test of self-discipline and a test of breaking free of societal norms that are harming our wallets and the planet, and it can be a lot to do, and it can be very long. I have been at this for a year and a half and I'm still not done. I'm really hoping to be done by the end of this year, but that would still be 2 full years of doing this before I got to a place where it was doable. And I know that there are other bookish media influencers that had bigger TBRs than me when they started their challenges. Godspeed to you. But I would like to know, do you have any kind of zero TBR, lower the TBR challenge? Have you ever tried a more general no buy challenge, a buy nothing challenge? Do you use any specific services when unhauling books? I would love to know all of that. Please let me know down in the comments below. And with nothing else to say, I hope you have a wonderful day and a marvelous tomorrow.